I was in the office, buried under a stack of reports that felt heavier than they had any right to be. They weren't particularly complicated or urgent, yet they weighed on me with a strange, dull pressure that I couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the monotony, or maybe it was that quiet ache I had begun feeling more often in the last few years, a sense of drifting through routines that no longer sparked anything inside me. The steady hum of fluorescent lights blended with the murmur of distant conversations, creating that familiar corporate haze I had grown far too accustomed to. I stirred the lukewarm coffee on my desk, knowing exactly how it would taste, burnt, flat, and forgotten. It was the same flavor most of my days seemed to carry lately. When the soft ping of a notification appeared on my screen, I assumed it was another reminder about an overdue report or a team update I would skim and then promptly forget. But it wasn't an email. It was a direct message from Thomas, my boss. His words were simple, polite, and completely ordinary. "Can you come into the conference room for a moment?" Yet something about the phrasing tugged at me, a vague pull I didn't understand. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles out of my blouse, and walked down the corridor with steps that felt a little too aware of themselves. The conference room welcomed me with that familiar blend of polished wood and citrus cleaner, a scent I had always found oddly comforting. Thomas stood near the window, the skyline stretching behind him. In the soft light filtering through the glass, he looked different, calmer, less guarded, and somehow more human. His smile was gentle when he turned to me, and I sat down across from him, not knowing why my heartbeat felt just a shade faster. He didn't open a laptop or shuffle papers like he usually did. Instead, he paused, as though searching for the right entry point into a conversation that didn't belong in a corporate space. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an unexpected softness. He told me he had noticed how hard I'd been working, how much weight I had been carrying quietly, how invisible those efforts often were in the machinery of the workplace. His words should have been nothing more than a standard management gesture, a casual pat on the back. But the sincerity in his voice changed everything. It wasn't scripted courtesy. It was recognition, real, direct, unguarded. Something in me loosened at that moment, something I hadn't even realized was clenched. We talked about work at first, but somehow the conversation slipped into life, about routines, about exhaustion, about the small unnoticed victories that fill our days without anyone stopping to appreciate them. By the time I left, the air around me felt different. Lighter. Warmer. And I didn't know why. The rest of the day passed in a slow, reflective haze. I tried to bury myself back into spreadsheets, but every now and then I found myself smiling at the memory of that conversation. A strange warmth had settled somewhere inside me, subtle yet insistent. I knew it wasn't anything dramatic, no spark, no romantic tension, no boundary crossed. But it was something. And it lingered. Later that afternoon, when Thomas's assistant approached my desk with another message asking me to return to the conference room, something inside me fluttered, not with fear, not with confusion, but with a quiet anticipation I couldn't quite name. When I entered the room again, the sunlight had shifted, gilding the space with a softer glow. Thomas looked up at me, and his expression told me this wasn't about work. We talked again, this time more freely. He shared pieces of his life, things I never would have imagined the strict, polished, always composed Thomas revealing. He spoke of his love for painting, his frustrations with how rarely he had time for it, the way colors helped him make sense of things he couldn't explain aloud. I found myself laughing softly at the image of him struggling with a brush, and he laughed too, easing into a version of himself I had never seen. There was no romantic gesture, no inappropriate comment, no lingering touch. Just two people sharing a small, unexpected corner of humanity that felt strangely precious. When he complimented my work in a tone so genuine it almost startled me, it struck a part of me that had been overlooked for far too long. And I realized how rare it was to be truly seen, not as an employee, not as a name on a report, but as a person with depth and quiet effort and longing. That night, when I lay in bed, listening to the soft, familiar breathing of my husband beside me, I found my mind drifting back to Thomas, not with desire, not with guilt, but with curiosity. With a warm echo of something gentle and affirming that I hadn't felt in years. I wondered why that mattered so much. And why I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next morning arrived wrapped in that same quiet glow of anticipation. I didn't tell myself that I expected anything. I didn't consciously seek anything. And yet, as I stepped into the office, my senses felt attuned to something invisible but present. When Thomas's message arrived again, "If you have a moment, I'd like to continue our conversation," something inside me softened. In the conference room, we sat across from each other again, and the conversation unfolded even deeper this time. The walls between us, professional, emotional, human, thinned in ways neither of us fully acknowledged but both felt. He asked about my childhood, about the dreams I once had but no longer talked about. I found myself telling him things I hadn't said out loud in years, how I used to paint too, how I used to imagine traveling, how I once believed my life would feel more alive than it had turned out to be. His listening was a gift, steady, warm, unwavering, and in return, he shared his own quiet disappointments, the cracks in his perfect facade, the weariness he carried alone. We became mirrors for each other, reflecting back the pieces we hid from the rest of the world. And somehow, that connection felt more intimate than anything physical could have been. There was a moment that day when neither of us spoke. We simply sat there, the city's noise muffled behind thick glass, the golden light stretching across the table. And in that silence, I felt it, a shift, subtle but unmistakable, the awareness that something delicate and dangerous was forming between us. Not desire. Not longing. But emotional closeness, unspoken yet undeniably real. And so it began. Days blurred into each other with a strange new rhythm. My mornings started with a sense of expectation I tried to ignore, and my evenings ended with the quiet guilt of knowing I thought more about Thomas's words than my husband's. Not because anything inappropriate had happened, but because emotional intimacy can bloom without a single boundary being crossed. It can grow in shared glances, in gentle understanding, in the knowledge that someone sees you more clearly than the person you share a home with. Thomas and I found ways to talk without calling attention to it. A message here, a brief conversation there, a shared moment in the hallway. We never touched. We never flirted. We never crossed into anything that could be labeled improper. And yet, something between us deepened with every passing day, an invisible thread tightening, pulling, weaving our stories quietly together. One rainy afternoon, as the office hummed with the usual noise, Thomas asked me once again to step into the conference room. The room felt softer than usual, cloaked in the muted gray of the storm outside. We talked about nothing and everything, about stress, about restlessness, about the quiet ache of feeling unseen. And then, gently, he told me that he valued our conversations more than he could express. That talking to me had become the best part of his day. I felt the words settle into me like warm water. Not because they were romantic, but because they were true, and because I had begun to feel the same. I didn't tell anyone. Not my husband, not my friends, not even myself in clear terms. But I knew. I knew something was happening, something quiet, emotional, and real. Something that existed in the space between friendship and longing, grounded in vulnerability rather than desire. The more we spoke, the more I felt a quiet, dangerous comfort forming between us. I began to look forward to the safe warmth of his presence, the genuine weight of his attention, the rare feeling of being understood without explanation. And slowly, subtly, I realized that my marriage had been running on autopilot for far longer than I had admitted. My husband and I still shared a home, a bed, a life built on years of history. But somewhere along the way, we had drifted into different emotional worlds. Conversations had become exchanges of logistics, bills, groceries, schedules. Dinners were eaten in silence. Nights passed without connection. None of it was dramatic. None of it was harsh. It was simply the quiet erosion that happens when two people stop truly seeing each other. And in that space of emotional emptiness, Thomas's presence became a lifeline I hadn't known I needed. Weeks passed. Our conversations continued. We grew careful without planning to, ensuring no one in the office misinterpreted the growing closeness between us. But in our shared silences, the truth became harder to ignore. We had formed an emotional bond that neither of us had intended but both of us quietly cherished. One early evening, after most of the office had left, I stayed behind to finish a report. I heard steps behind me and looked up to find Thomas standing at the doorway. The lights were dim, and the quiet felt heavy in the best possible way. He didn't ask me to join him in the conference room. He didn't ask anything at all. He just said that he appreciated me. That I mattered. That I brought something into his days that he hadn't realized he was missing. I remember the way my heart felt. Full, overwhelmed, and afraid all at once. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake thinking about how emotional infidelity doesn't begin with a kiss. It begins with understanding. With connection. With the subtle, dangerous comfort of being seen by someone who isn't supposed to see you that closely. And somewhere inside me, a quiet truth settled. I had crossed a line, even if no rule had been broken. Thomas and I continued our gentle orbit around each other. Our conversations grew deeper, our understanding richer, our silence more meaningful. And the more it grew, the more conflicted I became. I loved my husband. But love isn't always enough to fill every corner of the heart. Sometimes someone else touches the parts of you you didn't even realize had been neglected. There came a day when Thomas confided in me about his own loneliness, a loneliness that lived beneath the surface of his professional success, his structured routines, his polished exterior. He told me how rare it was for him to feel connected to someone, how surprising it was that he felt that way with me. I felt his honesty like a warm weight in my chest, heavy enough to pull something loose inside me. He didn't ask me for anything. He never crossed a line. He simply allowed himself to be human with me, and in doing so, gave me permission to do the same. And that, I suppose, is where emotional infidelity truly begins, not in desire, but in vulnerability. The more I thought about it, the more I understood the complexity of what was happening. Emotional cheating isn't about breaking vows. It's about breaking the quiet, unspoken expectations of where your emotional loyalty belongs. Mine had begun drifting toward Thomas long before I understood the depth of it. I found myself thinking of him during mundane moments, making coffee, commuting, sitting beside my husband while watching TV. My thoughts weren't romantic, but they were intimate in the way that mattered most. I thought of the way Thomas listened, the way he shared, the way he understood pieces of me that had gone dormant over the years. I thought of the comfort I felt in his presence and the warmth that spread through me whenever he spoke my name. I knew it was wrong. And yet it felt inevitable. There came a Friday afternoon when our bond reached a quiet peak, without words, without gestures, without crossing any physical boundary. Thomas and I sat in the conference room again, sunlight fading into soft dusk. We talked about nothing for a long time. Then, slowly, our conversation drifted into the territory neither of us had dared to touch before, the acknowledgement of our emotional connection. He admitted that he cared for me deeply. I admitted the same. There was no confession of love, no longing, no desire. Only a quiet, profound truth. We had become emotionally intertwined in a way that neither of us had intended but both of us felt powerless to deny. In that moment, I understood something essential. Emotional infidelity can feel stronger, more consuming, more dangerous than anything physical. It roots itself in the heart, not the body. It builds itself from trust, not temptation. It grows in silence, not passion. We didn't touch. We didn't lean closer. We simply sat there, breathing the same quiet air, acknowledging a truth we could no longer ignore. When I returned home that night, the weight of what was happening settled into me fully. I loved my husband. I didn't want to hurt him. But I also knew that part of me had drifted somewhere else, to someone who saw me in ways I didn't know I needed to be seen. The next week, I made a difficult decision, to pull back, gently but firmly, from the emotional closeness I had formed with Thomas. Not because I didn't care about him, but because I cared too much. When I told him, he understood. His eyes held a quiet sadness but also respect. He told me he valued me enough to step back, to protect what mattered to both of us, my marriage, my peace, my integrity. And slowly, carefully, we eased ourselves away from the closeness that had grown so quietly between us. We still worked together. We still spoke, but the emotional intimacy softened into something safer, something more sustainable, something that didn't exist in the dangerous territory between connection and longing. In time, the intensity faded, settling into a gentle memory, one filled with warmth, gratitude, and quiet understanding. I never forgot what we shared, not because it was forbidden, but because it reminded me of something important: emotional needs are real. Connection is powerful. And being seen is one of the deepest human longings we carry. I didn't fall in love with Thomas. But I did fall into understanding with him. And that, I realized, was its own kind of infidelity, quiet, tender, and profoundly human.